Last time I did.
You want to go on the car? Yeah, sure.
Late winter day, and winter doesn't quite want to leave us this year very soon, does it? But we're real thrilled about having all of you. This program we're planning today is something that we had thought about way back last July, and some of you maybe were even contacted back that early. It's a program that we thought would be fun for everyone, and you know, we like to reminisce, we like to think about the way things were, and there's so many good stories to tell. A lot of times things that aren't written necessarily in books or newspaper articles or whatever may be held in your memories and may be fond memories. So everybody feel free to listen and to share today. Beulah is going to give us some guidelines for our program, and Beulah and Helen have been wonderful resources, have given their hearts and souls to this program. So we wish you a hearty welcome and enjoy the afternoon.
Thank you. Well, as you notice, I have put at the top of the pages, this is an unofficial guide of our downtown Rensselaer, of our memories. Unofficial because, as Helen and I tried to think about how the Main Street was put together back in those days, perhaps we have some of the stores in the wrong place, and we're expecting to be straightened out this afternoon. To start with, I'd like to read to you an excerpt from an article written by Mrs. Mary Ellen Thompson. That was Mrs. Alfred Thompson, who came here in 1855. She wrote a paper for the Ladies Literary Society in which she talked about how Rensselaer was when she first came here, and I've taken a few things from that. In 1855, when the Thompson brothers came to Rensselaer, there were about 500 inhabitants. Now, the Thompson brothers brought the Mccoy Bank here from Ohio. Most of the business was done on the north side of Washington Street between Liberal Corner and the Ellis and Murray store. Now, how many of you know where Liberal Corner is? Well, good. Bob knows. I told him already.
That's the only reason I know.
Well, Liberal Corner was at the intersection of Washington Street and Front Street. There was a dry goods store at Liberal Corner at one time, and also a grocery store. The residence of George Spittler stood about where Harvey's is now. Also, there was a house near there owned by W.W. Wishart, in which he sold dry goods in his front room. Thomas Irwin lived in the old Sailor House, which is where Bank One is now, and Ellis and Murray must have bought it. The Dunlap Hotel, later called the Central Hotel, was where the Forsyth Building is now, and it cost $2.50 a week to stay there. On the south side of the block was a drugstore, a tailor shop, and a whiskey shop. Now, we were going to start with Merlat's, but Perry hasn't gotten here yet. Let me tell you a little bit about that particular spot. That is where the first house, the first log cabin, was built in 1837, I think is the correct date for that. The Joseph Yeoman family built the cabin there and lived in it until the Van Rensselaers came. And then I believe Mr. Van Rensselaer's sister and her husband and family moved into the cabin. Relax garage is there, and as far as I know, that's about the only business that's ever been there. And I think we'll just skip over that right now until Perry gets here.
John's over there, and his dad was the blacksmith in there.
John, at Relax. Uh-huh. Yeah. You want to say anything about that?
He was on Front Street there, worked for Frank King, first I can remember. First month. He worked in it, Shorty worked, my father worked. And that's where the insurance is now, and of course the building went back to Miss Brothers.
Yeah. Now, if you want to say anything, you have anything to say, I'm going to treat you like I did my kids. Hold up your hand, because we can't have everybody talking at once. So if you have anything to say as we make this trip down Main Street, please make yourself known, because we'd like to hear from anyone who has anything to contribute. Let's go across the street from Perry's. There was a poultry house there one time. Does anybody want to talk about that place? It was a poultry house. It was once a creamery too, I think.
Elizabeth's got her hand up.
Elizabeth, okay.
It belonged to a man by the name of Benny Fendi, and he bought hides, animal skins, and then he put in. He lived next door there. That building ran clear down to the river. It was a frame building, and then after that was a creamery, and it bought cream and churned butter. And after that then was the Jasper County distributors.
All right, okay. Now
Very
is-
near.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, that place of business that they sold hides, and they called it hide vendors. They're down to the
Yeah. Okay, Perry is here now. We'll just take a little minute here for Perry to get seated. Felmy told us about his father being a blacksmith along that same space there. Now, tell us a little bit about your family business that's been there forever, as far as I know.
Well, the garage there started in 1910. But before that, there was a hitch barn there. And a feed store. I mean, that was run by the Duvalls. That was built around 1882. 1810, which there was 10 partners. It was a corporation. I should have put the name of the list, but it was Granville Moody and Loss Thompson, and Dad. I think Dr. Pressers. There was 12 people in the corporation. And so that was back when that chain drive automobiles, the chain drive went back to 2 wheels. A lot of them had solid tires on them, solid rubber tires. And going down to the bridge, which was the old bridge, there was all gravel and sand went up a hill until they changed that and bridged it and rebuilt it at that time. And on the west side, where the garage was, Wright's had a store to start with down there at that place, a frame building now, or place. And Bill Wright used to tell me about what was happening there and whatnot. And then on the other side of that was Sharp Studio. That was right down by the river. So that is all on the south side of it. On the other side was an old building, and I think it was spurs and everything.
Yeah, we just talked about that.
Later, I.H. Riley took that over. He wanted cream and eggs and stuff. He hauled those to Valparaiso until 1933. That's when we got the beer permit. And then it went on from there until he finally sold out later.
All right, we're going to cross the street now, cross Front Street to what is now a filling station, but was Wright's Furniture Store. That's the way we decided to identify it. And we had a lot of things to talk about there. That was where one of the early theaters was. And I had a letter from Helen Rhoades, and this is what she talks about the movies. One day, when the movie house was relatively new, they had a showing of one of the great dramatic movies of early times. The posters in part said, "Presents," and then the name of the show. A group of little girls who were just beginning to read, saw the presents and thought it said presents, where they would, so they decided they would go to the show, and they didn't get any presents, and they went home considerably miffed. That's from Helen Hilliard. All right. Now, Wright's Furniture Store came in there, and it was one of two, she'll correct me if I'm wrong, one of two 3-story buildings in Rensselaer. And, of course, it burned. Can anyone think of anything else that was in there besides Wright's Furniture Store? Behind it was the undertaking parlor.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The undertaking parlor behind it.
Yes, the funeral parlor was behind Wright's Furniture Store.
Well, at one time, the post office was on the corner there. And next to it was the Princess Theater.
Yeah.
And belonged to Fred Phillips. And in the front part, he sold pianos. And in the back part, was the Princess Theater.
Okay. Bill, did you want to say something?
There was a barber shop in the basement there.
Yes.
Oh, was there?
Jarrett had a brother.
Really?
Yeah,
That's interesting.
Herb Black played the piano free of charge.
No, Mary Horton.
He's got the last name on
Wrong
it.
pair.
Mr. Horton, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Free of charge. Wednesdays and Saturday night.
You know, my sister got to be a pretty good piano player, and the reason she wanted to learn to play is that she wanted to play at the movies like Mary Horton. That's her ambition.
I have the doors that Fred Phillips had in that original theater. They're like swinging saloon doors, and they have a cut glass fancy work set in the doors. So look, I have those. I'll put them in my home someday.
Yeah.
After I restore them. And Fred Phillips' brother, his name was Gus, and he was Rensselaer's only movie star. He was a cowboy actor in the silent days. And I one time had a life-size picture of him, but my mother got rid of it.
Gus is buried here, isn't he, in Rensselaer, or is he not? No, I think that's wrong. Anyway.
Two of them parties.
Yeah.
When we built our new house, Bill Downs, his grandfather, built it. We had to have some furniture. Of course, we didn't have much left after we bought the house. So we went in, and Clint Colbert waited on us. He had never married. I don't know how old he was. To me, at that time, he was an old man, but of course he wasn't. And so we bought our furniture, and about 3 years later, we had a baby. I went back and I bought a baby buggy of him. We went upstairs in the elevator, and he said, how high do you want to go? I said, I've got my last week's paycheck that I have earned. in Dr. Gwynn and Dr. Kemp's office. It's $12. Well, I buy a baby buggy. He said, pick out any one of those you want. So I picked out the prettiest one. A few months later, my dad stopped in he said, to read the Tribune, but I know he came to see the baby. And Ed came pushing her out in the baby buggy. Dad says, hasn't that kid got a baby bed yet? And Edmund said, no, we're waiting on another check or two. So I went back and I took the baby with me. And Paul Arnott was there. And Clint says, take her upstairs. We got 2 baby beds up there. And he said, I've always wanted to push one of these perambulators around with a baby in it instead of just pushing an empty buggy around moving it. So when I came down and he went to ring up the baby bed, Clint says, Grandpa Parkinson was in here yesterday and paid me.
Well, I think we could all tell a lot of stories about the Wright's Furniture Store. Helen Rhoades did mention that children, they sold toys, and they had wonderful toys. So at Christmas time, mothers would take their children into Wright's and leave them there while they went shopping, and they were fascinated with the toys. All right, let's go across the street now to what was called the Niles Hotel, the other 3-story building in Rensselaer. I think it's interesting that they're both gone now. At one time, before David Niles bought that property, there was a rooming house called the Cotton House. It was called the Cotton House because the man who owned its name was Cotton. And it was moved when David Niles bought the property. It was moved over to just south of the Methodist Church. And in around 1900, the Methodists bought it and tore it down and put in a parsonage, which it too has been torn down. We were hoping that Gwendolyn would be here today because she did spend some time in the Niles house when their house, the Cannell house, had a fire. And I was hoping she would be able to tell something. Did anybody else have any experiences of staying in that hotel when it was a hotel? Well, there have been some things downstairs. The Democrat office was there at one time. There was a bakery there at one time. Does anyone else have a memory of that?
Joe Jeffers had a restaurant there.
Who did?
Joe Jeffers.
Oh, did he? Then is that where the Silver Grill was too?
No.
No. Okay. All right.
Frederick Beeler was the baker at Clark's Bakery.
Okay. All right. Then we'll go back across the street. You know how very free we've always been. Maybe we're not so much now, but we cross Washington Street all the time. Right in the middle of it, the traffic stopped and you went across any place you wanted to go. So that's what we're doing today.
There were a number of other businesses in the bottom of that
All right.
hotel.
Go ahead, Paul.
There was John Igle's had a butcher shop in there.
No.
No, he's going down farther.
That was down farther?
Yeah.
Oh, I know there was a barber shop in there.
That could have been.
And there was...
Joe Ford had a barber shop in there. Next door to Democrat office.
Could be. We have him located in another place on Main Street too.
That butcher shop was never in there.
I don't think so.
The design of they all had those cast iron columns and the cast iron steps going in. It was all tied together as far as appearance-wise then.
Well, it was down farther.
It was down
But
farther.
one time there was a Ritz Theater along there too.
Yes, there was a theater on both sides of the street there.
That was Rex Warner's, wasn't it?
No, it was the Rex Theater, and I believe he did have something to do with that, yes. Well, let's go across to Warner's Hardware. What do you remember about that? Anybody?
Well, it's been there a long time.
Yes, it was there.
It was wrecked up. Warner was one of them, I think. two brothers that were there.
Yes, Helen and I have talked over a lot of these places. She has a good story about base burners.
We used base burners instead of furnaces in the basement. Not many of us had them. We had these charcoal burners. They burned hard coal. And every spring, when we were through with them, we took off all of this nickel that was on the sides of them and on the front of them. We dismantled them, and the bottom face part, the main part of the stove, we put on some rollers. And Warner's Hardware came by with their truck, and all we kids rolled all this stuff up in paper, and it was put in a box with our name on it, and it was taken to Warner's Hardware, taken upstairs and stored. And then about October, when it began to get cold, they brought them back.
My brother worked there for a while, and he remembered doing that. Of course, I remember the roller skates we used to buy at Warner's, and we had to have a skate key to keep them tightened onto our shoes, and we wore the skate key around our necks, but we were constantly losing them. And so Warner's had a good business selling skate keys for our nickel. Anyone else have a memory of Warner's Hardware?
Upstairs in the upstairs rig where the armory was.
Yeah, the armory was upstairs.
There was Orly Klaus had a grocery store right in there one time.
Did he? Oh, he was certainly up and down the street, wasn't he? All right, then we go on up this street to Jessen's Jewelry. Gurney Jessen and his sister Claire. Claire was a...
His sister was
Claire.
All of our diamonds came from there, and most of our wedding bands.
Yeah. She was an optometrist, right? And then we talked about the Democrat office, and then going on up to Hilliard's. I have another little note from Helen. Are we right in putting Hilliard's next?
I think the Rice was in there before that.
Right, it's on the other side of
On the
that.
north side, we're doing it this side.
Well, he was
Yeah, well, he was over there at one time.
over there one time before he was.
Yeah. That's where I remember the toys at Christmas time. My first memory of Main Street was from when I was 2. We had just moved to Rensselaer. Dad took me downtown when he went to introduce himself to the merchants. I was fascinated by all the displays in front of the stores. Among the goodies was a fire engine red wagon, which I immediately took and headed down the middle of the road away from Dad. Guess who got a brand new red wagon? Mr. Hilliard had when he first came to town, had a clothing store, but eventually he had an electric shop. And in the newspaper, at one time, he put out selected radio shows. He would tell you what radio shows were going to be good for that week, and he had it listed in the newspaper. Anyone else have a memory of the Hilliards?
Scotty had been a window dresser in New York City. He was very adept at creating window displays. He was quite a character.
Yes, he was.
I bought the sewing machine.
Somebody by the name of Hamilton was in with him.
Who?
Hamilton?
Hamill.
Hamill.
H-A-M-I-L-L.
I suppose I used it.
Yeah.
Hamill.
Bill.
You mentioned Hilliard's. Scotty Hilliard used to be in with a fellow by the name of Hamill, and they had the Hilliard and Hamill men's ready-to-wear store on the north side of the street, where O'Reilly's Bakery used to be.
Okay.
The building where Ed Hudson is now, in 1906, Edwin's father bought it. Fitz Bedford owned the building, and the Monat sisters owned the 25-foot ground. And the lots are the back end. The lots were laid out on Front Street. and this is Washington Street. So Ed Hudson has lot 11 and 12 off of the back end of it. It had to be bought separate. He bought the ground, the 25 foot of the ground off of the Monette girls, and Fitz Bedford lived out where the schoolhouses are now, and he owned the building, and he had a 99-year lease on it. And so Edwin's father bought it and had a grocery store there. Then next came Charlie Murphy. He bought the Rhoads out at the store, not the building, just the groceries. And after that came Albert Level with his Leopard shoe store. Then the building next to it was a better building, and our building was beginning to need work done on. So he moved over there. And then we fixed it all up, and Scott Hillard came in 1935 is when he came in.
Are you talking about where Methodist Law is now?
No, not that far down.
Where
Eddie Hudson's building.
Parking lot.
And then we'll go across the street to the little building that was on the Hookers. Did Ona get here today?
No, the last minute she.
Oh, that's too bad.
That was Maramar's millinery store
Yes.
for years.
It was a Milner store before Ona had it. Okay, then we're gonna go up to Parks's, and we have our expert on Parks's here, Pete.
I asked Joe to come, I thought he was gonna be there, because I don't have any dates on the,
Yes,
on
ma'am.
the Parkers.
You know what?
I went to work there in 1937. I worked at Long's, not Long's, the drugstore across. Family. I worked there first, when they first went into business there, because we did, instead of waiting on trade, I did painting and painted chairs and everything like that. And got them started, I worked there at the drugstore for a year. Then in 1937, I started with Ray. And it was run by him and his daughters, really.
Yeah.
But there was girls that worked, and we took a customer when they came in the door and followed them all over the store. Stayed with them until they were through buying.
That's a change, isn't it?
Very.
Mr. Parks had worked for
Bill Wright.
Jen Wright, Mr. Parks, so that's when he went into business. I don't know exactly when that was, but that's the story of that.
Right in that building there before that was Faith Restaurant.
Oh, really?
George and Faith.
Oh,
A restaurant?
Well, you know who was in there before that?
Yes.
It was Sutherland.
Yeah.
Berkshire.
Had a college in restaurant.
House, people by the name of House ran it before Kate's.
They were Berkshire.
That's back in 26.
And then after Kate's was Sutherland. There've been 3 different restaurants in there.
well, let's skip across to the Ritz Theater. I think this is the next one anyway. If we're wrong, right? We're wrong. We know it was along there someplace. Do you remember the times when they gave out dishes? And,
The movies.
yeah, the movies, That's where a lot of people got their depression glass, were at the movies.
Is that done by ticket?
Yeah. Yes.
That had originally been part of Wright's furniture store.
Yes, I
Because
think so.
the faded, painted sign is still visible on the side, on the east side of that building. It's not too legible anymore, but if you look hard, you can still read it.
Is that right?
I think that was opened in February of 1936.
Probably about right.
The reason this came into being, the palace had been built in 1928 on
Yeah.
Rensselaer. And some Greeks from Illinois, Champaign, Illinois, came to Rensselaer and bought this building and started to remodel it into a theater. And the man that had bought John Kressler out and owned the business of the palace, he didn't own the building, he owned the business, was a millionaire from Madison, Indiana named Johnson. And these Greeks had this thing started, and he went to them and he told them, he said, if you open this theater, I will go to every town where you have a theater and open one right across the street, so you're going to sell this. So they did.
Mr. Johnson was the one that built the Mars Theater down Lafayette, and his
He owned
daughter.
a chain of theaters.
Yes, and Doris and Roy Brandberg. I wanted Doris to be here. They worked for them, and that's what took them down to Madison. Yes.
And
Okay, let's go up to
Nobody
Tourette's.
mentioned bank night.
Yeah, bank
I
night.
remember bank nights when they would have several cash awards. You could sign a proxy card on Wednesday night or be there in person on Thursday night and collect it. You had 2 minutes when they called your name to get down and collect your cash.
Yeah.
Seemed like nobody ever won, but those were the longest 2 minutes in the world.
Okay, let's go up to Tourette's. That was a 5 and 10 cent store, I guess you would call it.
It was.
Let's move along unless someone has something special to remember about Tourette's, where our time is getting away from us. We'll go across to Murray's, and I guess that Helen and I are the only Murray's people here. We had hoped that Marge and Charlotte would be here, but they couldn't make it today.
Not for very long. 'Cause
Well.
I got a baby, so.
That's kind of, well, I never did work there, but of course my dad worked there for 40-some years. And the thing I remember about it, well, I remember a lot of everything. We could have it if Murray's had it, but if they didn't, we didn't get it. That was the rule of our family. And they had about everything as far as variety of things. And my dad was the bookkeeper. He sat up in on a little platform, and he made all the change. And they sent the money and the bill up on those pneumatic things. And Ed says he still has those up in his storage room, Ed Murray. And what I like to do was to go up and sit on my dad's lap and pull the chain when I sent them. I also remember the shoe department, which was in the back of the store, and they had the step ladders. The shoes were stacked clear to the ceiling, and they had to climb a step ladder, which ran along on a little track to get the shoes down. And then, of course, we had the grocery store, which originally was. What did we do? You told me.
Long's Drugstore.
Long's Drugstore, that's right.
You know, before you leave Murray's, I have a box over there that was used by G.E. Murray to send shoes to Chicago to get them repaired on the moon.
My goodness.
Oh, that's something. Well, Helen will tell about the grocery store because that's where her husband worked.
The first ones that worked there was Frank Morrow. He was the father of the Elder Kloppenstein. Charlie Simpson, Ernest Rainey, who most of you call Pug. And then Ed Rhoads came about the time Vic Comer did. And Wednesday nights, they didn't get away from the store until 10, 11 o'clock. And on Saturday nights, they didn't come home till 12. Everybody bought everything they could buy. If there was a little lug of apricots that was left over that was about ready to spoil, they came home to the Rhoads house. Why can't you can these up tonight? Because tomorrow they'll just so out the pint cans we got. He went down and got them, and we canned apricots till 2 and 3 o'clock sometimes, so they wouldn't spoil. They mustn't spoil.
Oh,
Mr. Ray Wood, Mrs. Ray Wood worked there, and Ruth Ames, and Susie Mecklenburg, you remember her? And Mrs. Raywood and Charlotte Hill later married, and then Marge Malkinchite in 1950.
And my brother worked there.
Did he?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Well, of course, Ivan Carson, you remember, and you mentioned Charlie Simpson. Hugh Constable.
Ivan Carson, later Jack Brown.
Yes. Yeah, there were a lot of, and that was kind of like family. I still call Charlotte Aunt Charlotte, and she calls me Aunt Beulah. I don't know how we got that figured out. And then, of course, Aunt Ruth has always been Aunt Ruth to me, Aunt Ruth Ames. All right, then we go up to Lee and Davison's. Now, that's still a part of Harvey's now, so that's all been opened up. And Lee and Davison's were in there. Kohl's had a store in there, coast to coast. That's where the AP store was at one time. Kroger's.
Didn't Smoky Wright have a restaurant in there?
No, it was next door.
It was where?
It was next door. It was another fill us in on.
The only thing I can say about John Meeker's store, I know when we, at one time, he was in the hardware business with my grandfather, and they split up, and John took the grocery store, and my grandfather took the hardware store. And when we, the only comical thing that I would want to mention is that when we went to move the shelves, counters out, there was some clang noise underneath there, and there was a false bottom in the bottom there, and here was about 18 or 20 strings. And we pulled one of those strings out, and each one had a pint of whiskey. And John used to buy whiskey from a fellow from Lafayette that came through and go to Canada and pick it up. He has a whiskey tester for the fruit, which I have, in a little wooden box. And I think he drank it. But he would pull one of those strings out.
Helen has something interesting to tell about
The
John
last
Meeker's.
day of April, 1933, about 2 o'clock, it started raining, and it never stopped. It not only poured, it double poured. And finally, the floodgates over at the light plant flooded, and we had no lights. Town was black. The next morning, when we all galloped downtown to our jobs, we had no lights, we had no water. Everybody went over to John Eager's. He had a whole shelf of dusty coal lamps. Down every one of them came, and they all was lighted that night.
Yeah. I worked there for a while. I could tell you a lot of details, but not now.
What was in all those barrels that he had there?
Crackers.
Oatmeal.
Crackers with the
Candy and cats.
I know he has cats.
Cats stayed on the cracker barrel.
Yeah.
Getting all the oatmeal.
And I bet I could put the candy back in that case where I stood with the nickel in my hand. And wait a second, and I could put her all back there, but it just licorice and so forth.
Yeah.
Wonderful story.
Yeah.
What memory of.
I was working at Dr. Glenn or Dr. Katz's office. Don't think it wasn't Sunday. We had a cistern at home, so I filled jugs with the cistern, and Mother sent 2 wash pans up for Dr. Glenn and me, and the other one for Dr. Cat. And we set these wash basins in old iron sinks. Glenn had one, I had one, and Cat had one. And we washed our hands once. We didn't always dump the water.
Your Mr. Eager is the one that saved the bank in Rensselaer when they closed. John Eager.
When the bank
Closed.
that story, I'll try to shorten it, but that story, I think it was in 1929 or 30, when was it, the bank? John told Lost Thompson that everybody that had money in there would get it. So we went to Chicago. I took him to Chicago and went on the Monon, went to Continental Bank in there, and he'd called ahead of time, and we got, they counted out $90,000 in cash on the table, more than I'd ever seen. And so John had a alligator bag, you know, and old-fashioned, they put it in that, and they wanted to know if he wanted any security. Rensselaer, and I said, no, I got my nephew here. So they took us down to the Newman Street station, and we got on the train there, and that was the end for the security. And I had bought a paper for John, and he said, well, you sit on the outside, and I'll sit for the window, and we'll put the money between us. So we got back on the train, on that milk train at night, and DeLoss Thompson was down there in an old Hutmobile to pick us up, and we took it up to the state bank and put it in the bank, in the vault, and I walked home, and it must have been about 8 o'clock or so, and I hadn't had dinner, but they fixed dinner for me, and I'd sit down to read the newspaper, and it wasn't any big concern of mine how much money was in that bag, or, you know, I could care less. But when I read that newspaper, and I got about 2 minutes in it, well, that newspaper started to go like that, and it shook, and that didn't hit me till I got home. But all the depositors got the money.
Yetch, is that where your store was?
On the corner?
No, in the John Eager.
Yeah,
Yeah,
in the old building.
yeah. Well, you want to recall some of the things about your store?
Well, there's one thing that should be covered somewhere, and no one has done it so far, and that's the
Oh, yeah, well, we haven't gotten that far down the street yet, though.
yeah.
Mhm.
Anyway, I've got some extra copies of the minstrels and the in full color, and I've got the names of the participants underneath,
Oh,
which is sometimes.
yeah. You had your Dave Hopkins. Well, let's go.
That's on my building.
Yeah, you have to skip the meat market, it's right next to John Eager's,
Okay.
west of it.
All right. Then I have those turned around. Yeah. Okay.
And they had a mirror in there that...
Oh, yes.
Oh, I wonder where that is.
Does anyone know where that mirror is?
I've often wondered. You can stand in front of it, you can be as fat as this and turn it up the other way. And just
Right in there someplace.
west of Eager's, right next door.
Right in there someplace, there's my grandfather's jewelry store, Kennel Jewelry Store. But there's nobody around here that's old enough to remember that.
Well, that was above
I have a picture of it over here.
Oh.
Put your power on, Mr. Hancock.
Jake Dyksville ran the meat market, and you remember the sawdust that was on the floor? And Jake was just a little smaller than I am, and he came out with a quarter of a beef on his shoulder and cut it up there on the block and give us a bite of bologna that was, no wood in the world could make it like that.
They had 2 baths at the back end of that, for the alley, just inside the door, that they made the bologna and the wings in.
Yeah, they
Well, let's go over to Wright's Restaurant. That certainly was the center of a lot of activities, wasn't it?
There's one person here in town that used to work there, that's still living.
Tiny Holder.
She here today?
No.
She's not.
Niles restaurant before it was Wright's.
My sister-in-law is still living, that worked at Wright's.
No, my sister-in-law worked there too. Yep.
I remember the big lecture fans on the ceiling.
That was my first job, was in Wright's Restaurant, Wright's Restaurant, washing dishes.
Okay. Well, we've talked about Argos Spas. Larson Hopkins was a drugstore, and it ended up being Hopkins and Henry. And they sold books along with Fendix.
Was it knocked down, the dentist right upstairs?
Yeah.
Yes, on the Hooker then went across the street to that building. Okay, Fendix Rexall, and Ralph isn't here. We were hoping he'd be here today. Well, I was going to tell you what Helen Hilliard had to say about
In
Fendix.
between Fendix and Wright's Restaurant's another store though.
Oh, is that
Kroger's store used to be in there. I worked there.
was that instead? But yes, that was in Lee and Davidson's.
Huh?
That was Lee and Davidson's store, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've already covered that.
No, Kroger's store was east of Wright's Restaurant. First store east of Wright's Restaurant.
Yeah.
No, I worked in the Kroger store there. I can tell you, Ray Dawson was the manager of it.
Oh, yeah.
Well, okay, this is what Helen had to say about Fendix. This was a good story. All the downtown merchants repaired to Fendix drugstore's attic on many Saturday night after closing hours. There they had a rollicksome auction sale of old stock that was stored there. Many a household laughed themselves silly over what the master of the household brought home. The good and the bad and the horrible were sight unseen put up for sale. I remember my dad coming home with various obnoxious nostrums, a box of 50 antique hypodermic needles, and wonderful surprise, a box of 12 engraved 24-karat gold Eversharp pencils. Does anybody remember when they did that?
Yeah.
You remember when they had the auctions at Fendix? Yeah. Yeah, okay. Well, let's go on to the penny store. Yeah. Norris, did you work at the penny store?
11 years.
Yeah, okay. Anything you want to tell? They had the...
Back then. The spelling of it is P-E-N-N-E-Y.
Yes, that's right. It sure is. They had those pneumatic tubes too.
Yes, they did.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was the Opera House.
And that's where the Opera House was, yeah. That's right.
We're in 1925.
Well, there's, yeah.
And it was a step up.
Yeah,
Because I've done business there for years and years and started the business.
that's where they robbed the, that's back where they
Yeah,
robbed.
and Ross Thompson put in bulletproof.
The only thing they did there is take the money out and they went out in the car and drove over between where John Dunlap lives and the Beaver House right on the corner there. They drove right in the garage back there and stayed there 3 days. Never looked home. And Charlie Halleck brought them back from Oklahoma in the 1929 Pontiac. Great people.
Yeah.
Honest people, great people.
That's the same
vault's still in
building,
that building
Huh?
too.
where Ollie Klaus had his grocery with Homer Hendrickson.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the same one.
And then they used to be down there in the theater building too, before they
Yeah.
moved to,
Yeah.
Okay, let's skip.
Doris decorated the penny store windows, I think, didn't you, Doris? She was the decorator.
Very good. They always used to use those for our Girl Scout things too. Got to put those in. All right, then the Rowdy's Bakery.
Well, that was quite a place back in those days. And I feel so young here, you know. I started back in 1941 working there. My uncle Dean Saylor was the head baker there. and he was quite a baker. And I had another cousin, Orville Rowan, who was quite a man that helped me in my profession. And with O'Reilly's, it was one of those kind of things when I was growing up, if you didn't have a bicycle and was able to have a paper route or to be a caddy out the golf course or what have you, you wasn't able to work anyplace. But I had no bicycle, so I asked my uncle if he would help me get into O'Reilly's. So when I was 15 years old, I started working at the bakery. And it was probably one of the coldest places in the wintertime to work and one of the hottest places in the summertime. One fan and there was no windows. And I thought they put out an awfully nice product. And back in those days, you cut everything out by hand. You had very little machinery, and the type of thing we are doing at Daryl's Pastry Shop today. And after working 15 years at O'Reilly's, Hank Hoover got into the act, and they had quite a wholesale thing. And at that time, when Hank got in, we had about 8 trucks out taking merchandise to Remington and Goodland and different places. But it is one of those kind of things I'll always remember getting my experience in O'Reilly's, because I thought it was quite a big treat. And we've been 37 years where we're at today. So 51 of my years has been baking. And so I don't know where I went wrong.
They can't say you're half-baked, then.
But I enjoyed starting at O'Reilly's, and it had been there for about 15 years when I started there, or 17.
They made donuts in the window.
I like to watch that donut.
With Uncle Lean, they're allowed to do anything.
He was a classmate.
Oh, that's...
Before that, where O'Reilly's Bakery was Mrs. Porcupile's millinery store. They used to make hats, and everybody had to wear a hat. And the hats were very popular. Everywhere you went, you had to wear a hat. All kinds of hats, expensive hats.
Okay, let's go on up to, I have that Fendig's Fashion, but it was Fendig's Fair. I remember that now because we used to call Fendig's Drugstore Fendig's Unfair. Elizabeth, do you want to tell us about Fendig's Fair?
Well, he was there a good many years before I was. I was there several years. And we used to have, the salesmen used to come and take their trunk, they'd bring their trunks of clothes and go in back of the old Mckeever Hotel. There was little rooms back there. And would bring their samples into that, one of those rooms, then we'd go down there and buy from their trunks. And they used to have shoes in there when I first went to work there. They had shoes.
I remember the bolts of material that those little gals would reach up heavy bolts of material. I can still hear as they unwound them on there. That was work for them.
We sold the cotton thread for a nickel a spool, and silk thread was 10 cents a spool. Somebody told me they paid $1 for a spool of cotton thread the other day.
Well, we did talk a little bit about Hendrickson's Grocery. Of course, Orla Koss was with him at one time. He was in that store, wasn't he? And then Johnny Michaels. It was his. Do you want to have it? Mr. Cameraman, do you have anything to say?
I live next door to where Homer's house was on Van Rensselaer Street. As a matter of fact, the house we lived in was Homer's house. And during the war, he rendered lard in his garage behind the house. And he'd get a bunch of his buddies back there on the weekend, and probably a Sunday during the winter, and they'd sit there with this big pot boiling back there, rendering lard, and these little pork cracklings would come up, and they'd pick them out and put some salt on them. And that was how they spent their afternoon. That's where I got introduced into pork cracklings.
Well, then we have the post office was there at one time. Next to Hendrickson's Grocery. And there were several places for the post office. At one time it was in the Dunlap Hotel. And the first post office was called Fez. While we were not Rensselaer, but we were Newton. And Joseph Yeoman was the first postmaster. There, along in that same area, Joe Reisling sent me this. Charlie Reisling opened the Hub store for men in 1928. It was located in the building on the corner of Washington and Van Rensselaer Streets. This building had previously housed the Trust and Savings Bank. In 1934, Mr. Reisling remodeled the building next door to the west and moved the Hub to where the post office had been. He occupied this store until his death in 1948. The business was sold to Falvey's. And that's a little bit about that.
There was a hat shop upstairs there too for a while.
That could very well be. Now, what?
I think they had a Greek had a candy store in there.
People congregated. Long's Drugstore was opened in 1888 by my grandfather, Abram F. Long, in partnership with John Eager on the south side of Washington Street, where Penny's catalog store was. The slogan for that store was, "We long to serve you and we are eager to please you."
Is
that right? The store burned in the early 90s, and Long's moved to the other side of the street next to Murray's department store in the room which later became Murray's Grocery. Abe Long and George Murray lived side by side on Park Avenue for many years, besides their businesses being side by side. In the early days, Rufus Knox, Bert Brenner, and Ernie Moore worked for my grandfather and then went on to open their own drugstores in Valparaiso and Morocco. Ernie Moore and his wife, May Clark, my home ec teacher, and daughter of P.W. Clark, the jeweler, retired to Eustis, Florida, where George Long Jr. and Jean opened Long's gift shop in 1973. My father, George A. Long Sr., joined his father in the store in 1913. Before 1920, French and Lardner Crooks, and they called him Laddie, came to work at our store, and their beautiful, I thought, sister, Jeanette, worked for Dr. Gwynn. Their older brother worked for Scott Hilliard and had come back to Rensselaer with a French bride. In 1920, the store was moved next to the Farmers and Merchants Bank, and a soda fountain was installed. And from then on, there was a steady succession of high school girls and boys working behind the fountain. In those days, Bertha Maxwell Robinson, Nina Smith Babcock, Maida Hauser Lee, and her sister Gladys came to work. Somewhere along that time, Virginia Wasson worked for Long's, and I thought her sister Mildred worked too, but Ed said she worked for Emil Hadley. Ivan and Louise Cedarwall came to work in the middle 20s, and after that, Ruth Overton Tudor and Esther Overton Hay worked. Jimmy McCallum was there about that time. Helen Mckeever Arnott worked on and off for years, and her stepdaughter, Dorothy Jane Arnott, worked in the 50s. Before that, Lola Smith Douglas worked, as did Avenel Warren when she was in high school. When the Depression started, Dee Dee and I worked behind the fountain, and then Lucille Large Rowan worked for several years. Bob and Herb Strawbridge worked after they moved back to Rensselaer in 1932, and later Dubs, George Long Jr., and Jack and Tess Strawbridge as they grew up into their jobs. After my grandfather died, and while Ed was overseas, I went back to work for my father, and I won't try to name all the girls that worked at the soda fountain. It became sort of a status symbol for girls in high school to want to work behind Long's soda fountain. And as Patty Platt said when she was about 5 years old, "I want to grow up and work at Long's so I can turn off the lights at night." Patty never did come to work, though through all those years, Tom Cox was the janitor until his death. For 25 years, the Strawbridge boys and then the Wood boys brought their father to the store in his wheelchair every afternoon. In 1960, after Debs had come to work at the store, we moved back to the sunny side of the street in the Jarrett building, which the show store had vacated. We continued there for 10 years until the fire Again, a total loss in 1970. Again, we moved to the present location, and this drugstore became Long's Gift Shop, and it is owned by Beulah. There were mothers whose daughters followed in their footsteps, such as Marvel Sanders Fenwick and her daughters. I won't even try to name the many that worked the last 45 years. I don't want to leave anyone out, and I can't remember them all. Many of my best friends are the girls I worked with, and one of the reasons I go back to the alumna banquet is to see the girls in the 25-year class. That's from me.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Was the Long drugstore in the Jarrett, where Jarrett's used to be?
Yes.
And that's when they burned things?
Yes. Okay, now we go to the Bank One. My memory is that was a bank, but...
The Raw clothing store was on the corner.
That's right.
They bank for 2 bank for years, then they...
Yes,
Yeah.
and I think we talked a little bit, that's Charlie Racing started there apparently. Anything else you want to remember about that?
John Dunlap had a lawyer upstairs.
Yeah. We thought we'd leave the upstairs out and just simply say that all along Main Street there were doctors and lawyers. And doctors' offices up those steep stairs, they only could do that because doctors did make house calls.
There was beauty shops up there too.
Yes,
The state bank was in that building,
Right.
that's right.
on the corner.
The State Bank.
State bank. It's First of America now.
Well, no, State Bank was where Homer Henderson was.
No, it was on the corner when I was a little girl because I had some money in there. I had a bank. If you went to the bank with $1, they'd give you a little bank. And then you put your money in there and took it to the bank. And I knew I had some money there, and I wanted something one day. And Dad didn't think I needed it, so I went into Fendick's drugstore and I wrote a check for $1. And I came home from school and he said, "Here's $1, you take it down and give it to Ben Fendick for that no-count check." Well, I was embarrassed, but Mr. Fendick told me if I had just written the savings account in the corner, it would have gone through.
How many of you remember Mill Iron's wagon that used to be pulled up there on Saturday night and Wednesday night? This is Dee Dee Racing's memory. Parked on the corner of Washington and Van Rensselaer Street, I remember the good toasted cheese sandwiches there with plenty of butter spread on them before placing them in the skillet and pressed down with a heavy iron-like thing. Charlie Blue bought the wagon from Mill Irons and placed it permanently on Van Rensselaer Street next to what is now the pub.
Charlie Blue. Yeah.
Bill Robinson and I used to be together once in a while on Saturday night or Wednesday night, and he'd always have to go by there every so often to see whether Charlie needed some more hamburger quarters worth, and I was involved.
Yeah. Just about a
They
little.
hamburger.
Helen has something to tell about that corner.
How many of you do remember Ernie Z?
Oh,
He lived on the corner of Elm and Weston Street, which is still north of where Marcia and Hal Gray lives. Every morning, he would get himself on this little cart that somebody had made, strap himself on, and he pedaled this way all to town. And he parked himself there by the stone block building where beavers are now. He lived to be 70 years old, and he died out at the county farm. And they needed the piano out there, and we girls were no longer at home, so Mother gave them the piano. And Ernie loved to sit on there, and his little legs dangled down, and he could play. He was blind as could be. How he ever got to town, how he played the piano. And he died on June the 22nd, 1952. He was 70 years old.
He lived at the northwest corner of Weston
Elm
and
and Weston with his sister, Grace Nestor.
Yeah, he
When
knew
she
everybody
passed
in
away,
town. You asked him who was that, and he would tell you his name by the voice.
By the voice.
He knew everything.
Yeah, what time is it? He'd say.
He's as near as a street person as we ever had.
Okay, now let's cross Van Rensselaer Street, and we're going to have to go. It's getting late. The Forsyth Building, which is now Fagan's Pharmacy.
That's where Van Lynn started this clothing store. Yes. And you burned.
He was there before Vegas. Rose Parker.
Yeah, Rose Parker.
He's talking about Rose and Parker's. I remember going there when I was a child. We lived in the country and we'd come into town maybe once or twice a month. But they had all of the women's clothing and shoes and so forth upstairs on the second floor, hats and all those things. Do you remember that, Irene?
Yeah.
And then back of this building, Dr. Washburn and Dr. Johnson had a tiny little office back in the back of this Forsyth Building.
They also had an elevator that everybody talks about.
Yes,
too.
they had an elevator.
Okay, then next to the Forsyth Building was the Warden's Grocery, which was established, and Jim was going to come, but he wrote out his memories. And I'm going to just kind of skip through this. It was established in 1923, and they continued ownership until Carl's death. It was Carl and William Warden, and William died first, and then Carl died in 1951. Well, I believe so. Yeah, Carl died in 1951. No, well, Bill continued. No, Carl died first, and they continued until 1957. And he mentions that customers frequently brought in their own baskets to be filled, their market baskets to carry their groceries home. And of course, he said they did have brown paper bags. He talked about the free delivery service on Tuesdays and Fridays. You could call up and order what you wanted by phone, and or bring a list into the store, and the folks would fill, the clerks would fill a metal basket, and then they would deliver them. And he said his dad did the delivering, and the boys helped with it. He and his brothers helped with the delivering after school. And he remembered that sometimes the customers would say, "Would you mind going down to Fendig's or O'Reilly's or Ross?" And he said he remembered going to O'Reilly's and Ross, and they'd get some thread from Fendig's and sundries from the drugstore. And this was all with no charge. It was just a little accommodation. And he mentions people that worked there, his mother Lucy and his Aunt Bessie and Marceline Nessman, Don Tanner, Marion Hoferlin, Carl Ferguson, or is it Seal Ferguson? And Betty Ferguson. And he talked about Estel Green. And he was the delivery man, too. He would deliver groceries for many of the stores. And he mentions the brand names that they carried. And he also mentioned that in the summertime, they would get a lot of their products from the local farmers that would bring in vegetables and fruit. And then they were the first people in Rensselaer to have frozen foods, and it was they brought in quite a few people just to see the bird's eye foods, fish and whatnot. He said on Saturdays, the most popular and busiest shopping days, the hours were from 7 to 9:30 or 10 o'clock. And then, of course, they had this wonderful thing of credit on the books, which accommodated many people. And I think that was a nice little contribution that Jim made.
Some of those stores carried people from crop to crop.
Yeah.
John had about $14,000 from various farmers. Most of it was from John Pepper and Law Thompson.
You're not supposed to mention that. Let's see, did that come first? Where did we have Rose Remick? Rose Remick was in the little building.
Yeah.
And our little
There's a
tiny
tunnel
place.
in there first.
What?
There's a little tunnel in there.
Yeah.
About 7, 8 feet wide.
Yeah.
You stand up and touch both walls
Yeah.
practically.
I don't know,
Is that where Hanley's went in?
Hanley's were in there too.
I think the newspaper was in there at one time, too.
Could very well have
They
been.
were on down, too. They were, there was a pool room in there at one time, but before that,
And the State Bank building,
and that's what it was.
Yeah.
It was the First National Bank. Louis Hollingsworth was president and went broke.
Yeah.
They had a big ball, round ball in the window where they kept the money.
Then Traub's had a clothing store along in there. And Darryl told me the other day, reminded me of Carmen's Restaurant, but was along in that same area. And then Rensselaer Republican was along there too. That's where Daryl's is now, right?
Collins had a shoe store there.
Yes.
Yeah. George Collins.
clothing store there.
Then during, well, we haven't gotten that far. Shorty Dunlap's Restaurant was another little narrow place that you could get a nickel hamburger. Then Rhoads' Hardware was along in there.
Isn't that where the bakery is now?
That's where the
No.
bakery is now.
No, where the Republican was. Where the Republican was.
Yeah.
Okay, then Gilmore's Barber Shop along there.
No, the meat market came first.
Well,
The meat market came before the barber shop.
You mean Hansel Barber Shop?
Pardon?
Hansel Barber Shop.
Where Harry Schindler was for so many years.
No.
It's still up there.
The market was started about 1896 by Milton P. Roth and Granville Moody. About 1900, Samuel Roth took Granville's place after that date, and it was a partnership called Roth Brothers. The building was built in 1909 by the Roth brothers. For many years, the telephone exchange was on the second floor above the market. The meat market was known for its homemade bologna. Every Friday, the two show windows were filled with bologna. One side was garlic flavored and the other was without garlic. And if you remember, not only the show windows, but the floor and the walls, it was all tile. It was just complete tile. So probably was pretty clean. I don't, that could be. As a child, I remember seeing George Ade and his driver in the shop just to buy bologna. Most of the butchering was done by Sam Roth and Denver Tudor at the slaughterhouse west of town, where one of the city wells is now located. Milt Roth insisted that all meat should hang for 30 days before being sold. At the back of the shop were two large refrigerators for just that purpose.
The refrigerators was not electrocuted, they were used, it was ammonia some way, and one time one of the pipes burst and that whole end of town smelled terrible. We all run the other way.
Yeah.
If you never saw that meat hanging out there, you would have never eaten that bologna because the mold would be that thick on those carcasses hanging out there. I was in there as a kid, so
Scraped it off, and it didn't hurt anybody, did it?
I spent a lot of time with my uncle and aunt when I was a little kid. And they both bought all their meat there. And my uncle would not buy a piece of meat out of the counter. He would force them to go back and bring the carcass in and carve it off while he waited. It had to be so thick and so big and all this. And I was about 4 years old. My aunt stopped in there one night. She lived in the apartments in the next door around the corner where Mrs. No, it was the chiropractor, Turfler, Mrs. Turfler's apartment. So we stopped in and got a steak, and we went up, and she fixed dinner. I stayed with her that night. And it was kind of tough. So on the way back, we were going to the movie. And I ran on ahead, and I ran to the butcher shop. And they said, well, hi, how was your steak? I said, Mac, it was so damn tough you couldn't eat it. And they never got over that. You told me about that for years.
I remember going in one time to buy some meat my mother sent me down for, and one of the help got out something, was cutting it, and Mr. Roth looked at me and he said, don't send Mrs. Arnott that piece of meat because she'll send it back. All right, now Joe, do you want to tell us about the corner building there?
Okay. My mother just liked grocery stores, I guess, because we owned the West Side Grocery out on Abigail Street, where Albert Level lives. And then after a couple of years went by, she went to work for Frank Weber uptown there on the corner. And when Mr. Weber passed away, the folks bought the store. Dad would do the delivering, and then Mother would get everything all set. And like you said, they had a big book, and it was used a lot. So when it got so that the stuff was pretty heavy, they decided that maybe they would change, and by that time we had the A&P store and a few other things, which was terrible. And for them anyway, they changed it into a card and greeting store, which they ran for about 4 years, and then they sold that to Mr. and Mrs. A.L. Lee. And Mr. Lee used to be the radio man in Rensselaer. So that's about it.
Joe, when McFarland's grocery store there before then?
Yeah.
I remember him because we liked to play checkers. You go in the side door, he'd be back there playing checkers. Somebody's back in front where he said, keep quiet and go out.
Well, Dick Yates worked for him, or had the store, Dick Yates.
Could have been, yeah.
He
Well,
lived
what
down,
went on, did Nick Gates come after that?
Yeah.
Didn't he buy out down
I
there?
think he did. He lived at the corner of Angelica and Front Street on the southeast corner, that little house.
The thing we all remember about Weber's was when they would deliver groceries, he always included the sack of candy for us. That was one time.
Yeah.
Would you ask if anyone remembers where both of our grandfathers owned a grocery store? And it was someplace in the vicinity of, I think, of where the meat market was, or maybe just a little beyond that, away from Joe's store.
I don't know.
Yeah, that was, well, it was, as I remember, it was when I was, about 2
Yeah.
or so, because I
What's the
got
name then?
What did they
Well,
call it?
Rowan or Lee. Frank Rowan.
Oh, I see,
and,
Frank.
Rollins Grocery, you mean?
Huh?
Rollins Grocery you're talking
Yeah,
about?
but my.
It was next door to Shorty Dunlap's.
Okay, that's,
Okay.
okay.
Where the Republican was, or where the?
No, it's
on
where
other
the
side?
Certain Roebuck catalog sales store, the west half of it.
Oh, okay.
And previous to that, Frank was down
That's Frank Rollins.
on the other side of the track at the depot.
Yeah, well, no, that was after, that was
Frank
after.
Was it after?
Yeah.
Well, then he moved
See,
Frank
on.
was on the corner where your folks were, because he had Francis and then there was a boy. I remember Francis.
Uh-huh. But, I didn't think he was on the corner, it was down a little way from there. And my grandfather, W.R. Lee, Walter Lee, was in business with him. But I didn't remember it being on the corner because it was down.
And,
It was a barber shop.
oh, the barber shop, that's right.
See, there was,
Gilmore's
there was
barber
a
shop.
variety of things there. Harry Wilshire shine shoes.
Okay.
Gilmore played poker in the back room.
Harry Wilshire, I was going to tell about him when we got to the Mckeever Hotel. He lived on the top floor of the Mckeever Hotel, and he loved to use the fire escape rope, come down the side of the building, and people would come down and watch him, and then he'd go over to the Gilmore's barber shop and shine shoes.
Yeah.
Is it okay to tell a little more stories?
Yeah.
Frank Haskell owned the barber shop. He lived down there, right on Canal, at Myers. And he wanted to sell. They wanted to go back over to near Willamette and go to farming. So he wanted to sell. So he wanted to sell to Ed Gilmore. Well, Mr. Gilmore was courting Anna Stockstead. And he wanted to marry her. And she said, I won't marry you because you don't have any steady job. What we going to live on? So one day he came down to see her and he said, will we get married now? I've got a job. She said, what you going to do? He said, I bought Frank Haskell's barber shop. She said, can you cut hair? He said, I sure can.
All right, now, we'll go over to the Mckeever Hotel, and Mildred's going to tell us a little bit about it.
Maybe some of you know a little more of the later years than I did, but in 1945, Emerson and McMahon came home from World War II, and in the spring of 1946, he bought the Mckeever Hotel, which was owned by J. Stockton and Charlie Porter. And it had been closed several years, understand over a small water bill. And so then it took a lot of renovating. And as you said, there was ropes in each room for fire escape purposes. And they removed them and put fire escape at the back of the hotel, iron steps to lead down so they could have it that way instead of the ropes. And in January then of 1948, I married Emerson. And he adopted Jimmy. And we went to the hotel, and that was a big adventure in that big building. That was a big hotel, 3 stories. And he had experience from his father's hotel, the Arlington Hotel, maybe some of you know, from Rochester, Indiana. So he had experience, and but I do want to say that it worked out beautiful in the hotel. And he had the difficult job of responsibility and management of the hotel and his family. And some of the things that was rented on the first floor was Dick Warren's barber shop. He was a World War veteran too. And Merle Russell opened up a small place and had his watch repair and some jewelry. And then the beauty shop and soil conservation service and the Ellis bookkeeping. You remember Ellis bookkeeper? Mm-hmm. He started there. There was a lot of different ones started there. Ellis bookkeeping and the Christian Science reading room. Some of you remember. And then I'll give you a little descriptions of the rooms upstairs. They all had iron beds. And a lot of them was real fancy. And the iron bed, and the desk was, they called them them days, a library table. Had a library table, and a straight chair, and a rocking chair. And they was beautiful rocking chairs. They had a lot of carved wood on them. And, the wash basin, and a wash basin, and most of them was marble wash basin. Really nice wash basin. So, and the price of the rooms, as I recall, was $2.75 single and $3 double. And later, I think when we moved out, they was $3 single and $4.50 double. And I guess don't hurt to mention, and the first person that Mr. McMahon registered in was a Japanese. He just come home from the service, and he thought a minute and figured he had to be American. So he was here sexing chickens for Russell Hadley, Japanese, and that's what they was good doing. And let's see, I carry that. so what, then, you'll hear a little of my experience of learning the hotel, and Jimmy learning it besides of me. And his dad showed Jimmy how to be a bellhop. And the Chicago Bears came after, when college, St. Joe picked up, while the college was coming, the Chicago Bears had come in and stayed at the hotel for a few weeks, maybe about a month. And George Hallis come in ahead, and I took him up, and he made the arrangements where they'd stay. George Hallis did that, and he made the assignments to the different Chicago Bears. So when they brought the Bears in, then I registered them in, and we had the room numbers for them. And we did have a few black ones in days, and one of them was a celebrity. His Jack Benny and Rochester on radio. They did. They had TV then. Well, Rochester's sons played with the Chicago Bears. So we got that all straightened out, where to put them. And they all were double beds. And some rooms had 2 in them, and some had 3. So they brought them in and registered them in, and Jimmy was the bellhop, so he brought them up. So Jimmy comes running down, and he says, there's only one bed in there, and them Bears, Chicago Bears, was so big. So there was only one bed in that room. Jimmy come running down and says, there's only one bed in there. And I said, there has to be 2. He said, no, there isn't. So these guys stood there, and I said, well, I'll go back up with you in a few minutes and get it straightened out for you so you can have it. So time we got back up there, went in that room, there was 2 beds sitting there. And they said there was only one bed a few minutes ago. And in the meantime, these Chicago Bears had played a trick on somebody and took a bed down. took it down the hall and hid it. Lefty take hold of his hand, and Jim could only go 1 block. And Lefty say, what's news on the corner? And I think Jim's mouth really went. He really told him all the news. Here's Lefty. And so it says here, Lefty, 45 years at the paper. And it's just when he retired, he's been there 45 years.
That's why Lefty got his news.
Yeah, he got his news together. Quite an experience. And one day in the afternoon, I relieved Emerson, and he was on all day, and I relieved him. And 2 men walked in, and they said they had a car wreck, and they was kind of bleeding and cut up a little bit. And I was feeling sorry for them, and they said, could they get a room? And I said, sure. And so I pushed register over, and they registered in. And they wanted to get cleaned up and bandaged up, and then they didn't have Band-Aids and things, so I went upstairs and took an old sheet, and we tore it up, and they washed up and tied themselves up, and they wrecked their car. So I got them all settled in that room, and came back down. I hadn't been down very long till the police come in. And they said, did you register 2 men in? And I said, yes. They said they were escapees from Michigan City. And they had their guns, and they had me so scared I was just shaking. So they said, where were they at? So I told them upstairs there. On Washington, to the corner was the studio. I see you have a picture of it over there.
We're going to talk about that.
Studio, you're talking about.
Yeah, we went down through there, past that, and Schultz's store, I think, was on the corner.
Joe Ford's barbershop was along there too.
Oh, yeah.
Anybody remember getting a haircut there? I remember having my haircut at Mr. Ford's.
It was 25 cents.
Yeah.
Rosemary, do you have anything you'd like to tell about your father's barbershop?
Oh, I spent a long time in that. I used to go in there and then go out back to a little place back of it where they did the laundry from the hotel.
Oh.
What's a big mango in there?
Okay, Tim, do you have anything to tell us about Parker's studio?
Well, he was an uncle of mine. And he had that studio, and I forget I think he bought it from Bartu. He come from Chicago. Well, he was born in Tennessee, went to northern Wisconsin, and then back went to school at Wisconsin University and come back and bought that studio. And he'd had some photography in Chicago, and he married Irma Kendall, my aunt. And, I don't remember too much about the studio, only that I've been in a lot. It was quite a unique. I never saw the arrangements of the building inside. It was quite, you had certain chairs and tables you sit on, and you took the pictures and put their pictures in those days. Then he, 16, he coached the football team out of St. Joe for a couple of years. And
Didn't he come from Wisconsin?
yeah,
Football.
And then he coached the Yellow Jacket football team, which was quite an independent team in the area. They played the Ferndale team down in Indianapolis, and everybody went down on the train, and I went down as a water boy. And so it was nothing to nothing, and so he had him have time out, and he had one of the players fake a fit over in the middle of the field. And when they all went over there to see what was going on, the other team and everything, well, they snapped the ball and run down. So that made Indianapolis stop. I think he went up into Wisconsin a lot in the summertime for a few months. They were outdoor people. They lived at the corner of Milroy and College.
Yeah, or Mike and Judy Kenny.
Can you imagine him coming out to the farm and taking pictures of family reunions?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You will listen there in I's house, an ice place you can buy ice down in that, past the Mckeever Hotel, down there somewhere. I have a recollection when I drove down.
Mine was the telephone.
Yeah, it was a block
Oh, it's
over.
gone down.
Was Harris's Creamery at one time. Actually, it was the location of Edison Marshall's home. And that house was moved and is over next door to Helen's. Then this other building was built there. I don't know what it was originally built for, but Harris's Creamery was in it. And then Schultz's secondhand store. I think that's all the time we'll spend on that. We were going to go across the street, but I think we won't do that now, Helen. It's getting so late. Let's go down to the courthouse. We have missed that. Helen Hilliard wrote this. Half the town drove their cars downtown in the afternoon and parked advantageously on Wednesday nights for the band concerts. And then they would walk home and then walk back. I think that we all, most of us that were around, remember those concerts and how much fun they were. I know the girls would walk together and the boys would walk together, and we'd walk around the square and around and the boys would walk one direction, the girls would walk the other, so we were always meeting. And then we also would get an ice cream cone at Long's or a hamburger someplace along the line. We remember Prof. Tanner, I think, from those early concert days. I think the courthouse is absolutely gorgeous. It's our castle. And one time they thought that everything was going north and that they ought to move the courthouse up north, and I said, over my dead body, I'll throw myself in front of the bulldozer first.
Bill, I think in 91, wasn't it?
I think it's 96.
96?
Yes, it'll soon be 100 years old.
$90,000.
Well, I haven't got that. I do have that someplace, but I don't have it with me.
Do you have about the cornerstone? Anything about that?
No.
Best Grant Russell's mother told me that her father, who had a tin shop across the alley down, and they had a copper box, and they put a copper box in there, and all the kids and everything threw pennies, nickels, and stuff in there. So when they open that in 100 years, I suppose they will, they'll find all those things.
If they could do it, we tried to open the one at the church when it was 100 years old, and it's impossible to get to it without the corner of the church falling, I think.
Well, I hate to say what might be in one out of the high school.
I think before we get to Irene, we must not forget Ed Ames.
Yeah, and I have to look something at age.
Let's have Irene.
All right, yeah.
I'll make mine short. I really didn't make any notes. I thought Beulah and just 3 or 4 of us would be down here and talk, and just look it turned out. I think I was the first girl from our school that ever went to high school, and that was a big deal. And I had a beautiful road horse that was broke to drive to a buggy or ride. Well, I rode her. And because that was the fastest way in the town, and then in case you met an automobile, that was rare, but it's possible. Well, you had quite a time with your horse, and it's better to be on her back than in a buggy. And I put my horse down at Leake's Hitch Barn. That's down there south of the courthouse where Rusk's used to have their garage. At that time, someone told me there was a Hitch Barn back here, but another, I think, was Hemp Hills, up here about where the Republican office was. Well, I was glad Dad put the horse in there for a reason. He'd bring the oats and the corn in, and I'd ride my horse, and a bunch of old men would be down. To me, they were old, but my uncle was one of them that hung out there like the boys go to the coffee shop. He'd take my horse and put her away. And I was glad we parked down there because there wasn't a chance of anyone seeing me come in on a horse, because girls didn't ride horses. And it was before we ever wore slacks. We wore midi-gloves, and that did pretty well. Well, I walked down, and now everything's gone. The barn's gone, the horse is gone, even the schoolhouse is gone, and I'm hanging on. I think I was the only girl in high school that rode a horse.
Well, we don't want to leave this without talking about Ed Ames. I wonder how many people we have on the police force now.
Oh, boy.
Well, we had one man, and his name was Ed Ames. And Joe Ressing told me this, wrote this to me, and I think this is an interesting thing. Ed Ames, the town marshal, was given the responsibility of checking overtime parking of automobiles on Main Street. His method of timing parked cars was to purchase a bag of popcorn, and as he walked along his beat, he would place a kernel of popcorn in front of the left rear tire of every parked car. 2 hours later, Ed would make his rounds again. If the popcorn had not been crushed, it was a parking violation. I thought that was an interesting thing.
Ed used to be up corner of Washington, Rensselaer, talking people, you know.
Yeah, the whistle.
So one time Tom Harmon come back to town and stopped and told me he just was stopped uptown with the police for speeding going down Main Street.
Then we have Lee Ramey for a night watchman.
Then there was another night watchman that lived over there where Dean Taylor lived. I can't think of it. Year before Ed.
Ed didn't have a gun, didn't have a car.
He had a whistle.
Ed had a gun. Ed had I don't know whether he carried it, but he had a pearl handle 38.
He never carried it.
He broke his leg while I was in the doctor's office. And to get compensation every week, we had to write in and tell the insurance company he still was on crutches. And I didn't dare fail, and Dr. Gwynn couldn't remember, so it was my job. So after we got him back on the feet, here come Mrs. Ames with a beautiful dish, I still have it, and a dozen linen handkerchiefs, and that was my reward.
Well, we were street smart, weren't we? Street smart back in those days probably meant where to get the best ice cream cone or the nickel hamburger, or how to avoid headaches if we were in trouble, what the next movie was on the different movie houses, and which direction to walk on band concert night. And this has certainly been an interesting afternoon for me. It's longer than I thought it would be, but I hope that we've all enjoyed it. That you've all enjoyed it as much as I have.
I would like to say two things. One
Okay.
thing is that there's a little more information that people might like to listen to on some tapes that Tom Cox sent me before he died a couple of years ago when I gave him the Historical Society. And,
Down there,
and I think also that we ought to have a round of applause for Beulah and Helen and the rest of the people who made this thing possible, and I would be in favor of another station someday.
Maybe we can do the side streets.
Did you get a count how many?
We had a little over 50. I'm just so thrilled that all of you came. The Friends of the Library have prepared some cookies for you and some coffee and lemonade. I hope you get a chance to stay and visit with each other a little bit. Thanks a lot for joining us. It has been interesting for relatively newcomers like me. I've been here only 24 years, and I learned a lot today.
I remember one time my dad and I passed through this.
48.
I